The noise never ceased. The huge shopping center was a beehive of activity, filled with hundreds of inhabitants, all of whom were hurrying about their business. Children ran between rows of toys, cashiers were punching checks, and crowds of visitors with different moods flowed along the windows like a river, carrying with them the smells of coffee, perfume, and fresh-baked goods. Amidst all this confusion walked a man in a dark gray suit with perfectly ironed folds. It was Jonathan Miller, the mall manager. At first glance, he looked like the embodiment of order. His step was confident, his gaze stern, and his manners cold and calculating. There was no room for chaos in his world, and he was proud that the mall ran like a well-oiled machine. But behind the outward confidence, there was another side. Jonathan was a man who did not tolerate weakness, disapproval, or even a hint of inconsistency with his ideals. This morning started off particularly nervously. One of the rented spaces just outside the main entrance was empty. A small businessman had failed to pay the rent. Jonathan walked by, jaw clenched. Weak, he thought, glancing at the unlit pavilion. For him, any failure was a personal challenge. On his way to his office, he glanced around at the employees. Some were lazily folding clothes on the counter. Some were too slow to serve a customer. Jonathan's gaze was like a spotlight searching for flaws. People averted their eyes, trying to avoid his displeasure. He liked everything to be perfect. Minus Mr. Miller, we've received a complaint from a customer. His assistant, a young girl with a short haircut, said timidly. She struggled to catch up with his quick stride. Again? For what this time? His voice sounded cold as ice. At the guards, someone said they were too rude to a woman in the parking lot. There shouldn't be any complaints, Linda. None. He cut him off. Deal with it. Now, something in Jonathan's mind told him that this day was not going to be a good one. There was a strange tension in the air. Even the familiar chaos of the mall seemed wrong, as if a small but important piece of machinery were about to break. When he reached his glass cage, the office overlooking the main lobby, Jonathan noticed something strange. At the fountain, in the center of a busy stream of shoppers, a man in a wheelchair had stopped. He was alone, staring silently around him, and a cap with the word MAGA emblazoned on it was on his head. Jonathan froze. He felt his irritation soar like a thermometer in the hot sun. What's he doing here? Flashed through his mind. Everything about this man made him inwardly protest. He did not know why, but something in his confident posture, in his stillness, seemed defiant. The crowd avoided the man. Some gave him quick glances, some wrinkled their brows, but he remained perfectly still, like a still stone in a raging river. Jonathan kept his eyes on him until he had a plan in his head. He decided that he would not tolerate this provocation in his mall, but as Jonathan made his way downstairs, something strange kept him on his toes. It felt like there was more than just a visitor behind this man, like he was here for a reason. Clenching his fists and quickening his steps, Jonathan had no way of knowing that this day would change his life forever. Jonathan Miller stood at the second-floor balustrade, watching the endless human bustle below. He was used to being the observer, the one who controlled, evaluated, and decided what was acceptable in his realm of glass, steel, and glossy storefronts. But what he saw today made him freeze. In the middle of the main hall, in the most prominent place, as if specially chosen, a man in a wheelchair sat motionless. He was a middle-aged man, dressed simply but neatly in a dark jacket. But it was not the clothes that caught Jonathan's eye, but the bright red cap with the large white inscription, MAGA. The cap seemed to emit an invisible force that irritated Jonathan to the core. His heart raced and his jaw clenched involuntarily. Why is he here? Why draw attention to himself? His mind was spinning. The man's gaze was as calm and unmoving as a sculpture, but it was that stillness that pissed Jonathan off. It seemed to him that the man in the wheelchair had chosen this place on purpose, as if he wanted to challenge him. The clothes, the posture, the red cap, everything seemed to have been thought out. Jonathan felt a wave of muffled irritation rising in his chest. People like him always want attention. They think their views are more important than others. This is a mall, not an arena for political statements, flashed through his mind. But deep down, Jonathan realized that it wasn't just the cap that irritated him. Something about this man made him feel uncomfortable, as if he knew more than he wanted to show. Visitors looked at the man. Some wrinkled their brows, some whispered, but he sat still, as if this were his home, not the mall. Jonathan thought there was something provocative in his stillness, as if he were saying to everyone around him, "Yes, I'm here, and I'm staying." Unacceptable, Jonathan thought, clutching the balustrade railing. This is no place for such demonstrations. He felt his irritation turn to anger. There was something about this man that made Jonathan want to intervene, to prove that he made the rules here. Suddenly, Jonathan saw the man in the wheelchair slowly raise his head and look directly at him. The gaze was calm, but so piercing that Jonathan's legs felt as if his legs were buckling. He quickly averted his eyes, feeling uncomfortable, but immediately brought them back. The man was still looking at him. Is he doing this on purpose? A thought flashed through his mind. The sense of control that Jonathan held so dear was beginning to slip away. His hands became damp with sweat, but he decided not to show his insecurity. I have to get down there. Stop this now. Jonathan quickly headed for the stairs, feeling his irritation mingle with anxiety. As he walked, questions swirled in his head. Who is he? Why exactly is he here? Why sit like that, as if he wanted to get everyone's attention? He still didn't know that in a few minutes his life would change forever. But there was already a feeling brewing inside him that was more than just anger or irritation. It was anxiety over something unknown, something he couldn't control, and this meeting was only the beginning. Jonathan walked down the stairs with the firmness that gives a man a sense of rightness. His every step echoed in the spacious lobby of the mall. His gaze was fixed on his target, a man in a wheelchair who seemed oblivious to the manager's approach. The people around him were going about their business, but some of them were beginning to pay attention to Jonathan. It was obvious that something was brewing. The man in the MAGA cap sat quietly, as if he owned the entire center. His immobility and relaxed expression only served to irritate Jonathan more. Why won't he even move? He's just waiting for someone to approach him, isn't he? Thought the manager, feeling his anger boiling over. Excuse me. Jonathan spoke loudly and sharply, stopping right in front of the man. His voice cut through the noise of the crowd, causing the nearest visitors to freeze. You do realize that this is private property? This is no place for political demonstrations. The man slowly looked up. His gaze was calm, but there was a certainty in it that unnerved Jonathan even more. I'm not demonstrating, the man replied calmly. I'm just here. This simple phrase sounded almost defiant. Jonathan felt his patience fraying at the seams. You don't? He asked with a grin that was more like a grin. Are you serious? Your hat, your behavior, it's all provocation. This is no place for such things. If you want to attract attention, Go somewhere else." A crowd began to gather around. Whispering went on among the visitors, and people pulled out their phones, taking pictures of what was happening. The man kept his eyes on Jonathan. "I'm not breaking any rules," he continued calmly. "I came here as a customer, and I don't need your permission to be here." The man's words sounded like a cold shower to Jonathan. "A client? This man thinks he can come in here and do what he wants under the guise of some rules? Customer or not, I'm not going to let you—" Jonathan began, but the man interrupted him. "Won't allow what? Wear a hat? Being in a wheelchair? Just being here?" The words sounded loud, clear, like a challenge to the whole room. The customers froze, their gazes darting between the man and the manager. The tension was almost palpable, like a taut string ready to burst. "This is my mall, and I make the rules." Jonathan didn't hold back, forgetting about decorum. His voice shook with anger. "Yours?" The man raised an eyebrow slightly, and the corners of his lips twitched as if in the shadow of a smile. "Are you sure about that?" This short phrase, spoken with a touch of sarcasm, confused Jonathan. For a moment he lost the thread of his thoughts, but then he pulled himself together, determined not to let a provocateur get the better of him. "If you don't leave, I'll have to call security." Jonathan cut him off, retreating into his usual language of authority. But the man remained still. He looked at him with a strange calmness that sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. "Call it in," the man replied. "Let's see what they say when they find out who I am." Those words hung in the air, causing the crowd to catch their breath. What did he mean? Who was he? And why did he speak with such confidence? Jonathan felt sweat running down his back, but his face remained stony. He didn't know yet that this conflict was only the beginning of something that would change everything. The crowd froze. There was a disturbing silence in the air, broken only by the distant noise of the escalators and the muffled music from the mall speakers. Jonathan Miller stood across from the man in the wheelchair, feeling his anger flare up more and more. He was used to his words having weight and his actions producing immediate results. But today was different. The man in the red MAGA cap sat calmly, as if everything that was happening did not concern him at all. He didn't argue, didn't make excuses, didn't even show the slightest excitement. His confidence was almost frightening, and that was what threw Jonathan off balance. "I repeat," Jonathan said, trying to keep his voice firm, "put that hat away or leave the center. Your appearance provokes visitors and creates unnecessary tension." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Jonathan's. There was no fear in that gaze. There was something in it that Jonathan couldn't explain, a mixture of dignity and slight contempt. "Tension?" The man repeated the word slowly, as if considering it. His voice was steady, but it was cold. "It's funny that you accuse me of provoking others. Maybe I'm not the problem, but those who can't tolerate other people's opinions." Those words, spoken calmly and even gently, hit Jonathan like a hammer. He felt his face flush with anger. "It doesn't matter," he cut off, trying to keep control of the situation. "My rules apply here, and I'm not going to let someone who thinks they can—" "Can what? What?" The man interrupted again. His voice had gotten a little louder, but still remained calm. "Be myself? Speak my mind? Tell me, Mr. Manager, what else don't you like? Maybe the fact that I'm in a wheelchair, or the fact that I came here without your permission." The crowd around me began to whisper. Some people were laughing, others were taking pictures on their phones. Jonathan felt himself losing control of the situation. He was used to being in charge, the man who was in control. But now this man was throwing him off balance time after time, as if he had anticipated his every move. "You don't know who you're talking to," Jonathan said, trying to regain some of his lost authority. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm talking to," the man replied, looking straight into his eyes. "Do you?" The phrase sounded like a challenge, and Jonathan felt his palms sweat. The man in the wheelchair didn't raise his voice, didn't use insults, but his confidence was as sharp as a blade. "I'm giving you one last chance," Jonathan said, struggling to keep his composure. "If you don't leave the center right now, I'll call security." The man was silent for a few seconds, as if considering what he had said. Then he leaned forward, resting his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair, and said slowly, "Call it in. I wonder what they'll say when they find out who I am." These words hit Jonathan like a thunderclap. The crowd gasped, and someone laughed loudly. The man still sat still, but his voice had the confidence of a man who held an undeniable trump card. Jonathan wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. The situation was getting out of control, and for the first time in a long time, he felt not only angry, but also a strange, uncomfortable sense of unease. He had no idea who this man was. But with each passing moment it became clearer. This was no mere chance encounter. The crowd was thickening. Whispers and muffled laughter began to turn into loud comments. The smartphone cameras in the hands of the visitors flashed recording lights. Each new glance directed at Jonathan was like a stab in the back. But the anger overrode everything logic, sense of proportion, even the inner voice that said, "Stop, you've gone too far." The man in the wheelchair was still sitting in front of him, serene and calm, as if he had nothing to do with what was happening. This ostensible calmness drove Jonathan crazy. "Did you put on this circus on purpose?" he said loudly, not caring about the tone. His voice rang like metal hitting stone. "You want attention? You've done it. Congratulations." The people around them held their breath. There was a look of surprise on the faces of many of them. Some of the mall staff tried to intervene, but Jonathan raised his hand, stopping any attempt to resolve the situation. "Your antics will not be tolerated here," he continued, practically shouting. "You're not a client, you're a provocateur. You came here to put on a show, and you think that your disability gives you the right to do whatever you want." These words, spoken loudly and clearly, seemed to split the air in the hall. The crowd gasped, and some people immediately began to discuss what was happening even louder. "This is too much," someone in the audience muttered, but the man in the wheelchair didn't even blink. He bowed his head slightly, his calmness now seeming intimidating. "Do you always talk to people like that? Or is it a special attitude?" he asked, looking straight into Jonathan's eyes. The words sounded calm, but they hit the target. Jonathan felt his face flush, anger mixed with the humiliation of the crowd's attention. "I'm talking to you the way you deserve to be talked to," he blurted out of control. "You've decided to make political theater out of this. You picked the wrong man to play these games." Someone in the crowd snorted loudly, and then laughter erupted. The faces of the mall staff expressed a mixture of shock and confusion. No one dared to interrupt the manager, but the atmosphere was getting hotter by the second. "Games?" The man raised an eyebrow slightly. His voice sounded like he was enjoying the situation. "No, it's not a game, Mr. Manager, but I can see you're losing control. Maybe it's time to stop before you make another mistake." The words, spoken with icy calm, broke the thin thread of Jonathan's composure. He stepped forward, pointing a finger at the man. "Mistake? The only mistake is wasting my time on you at all. If you think your tricks will make an impression, you are sorely mistaken." "I guess I made an impression after all," the man replied, nodding at the crowd. Jonathan looked around and noticed for the first time that almost the entire hall was now looking at him. The smartphone cameras were pointed directly at his face, and the whispers in the crowd grew louder and louder. It seemed to him that everything around him was shrinking, that the air itself was becoming heavy. "What are you doing? Put the phones away," he shouted in the direction of the crowd. "This is private property. You can't film here." But no one was listening. The tension reached its peak, and at that moment the man in the wheelchair straightened up. His face, which had been calm before, was now serious. "You're wrong, Mr. Manager," he said clearly and loudly so that everyone could hear him. "You're the one who put on the show, and if anyone here is a provocateur, it's you." These words, spoken with absolute certainty, hung in the air. The crowd gasped. Even Jonathan did not find something to say at once. He stood still, feeling his anger turn to fear. The man looked at him again, then looked around the crowd. His face was calm again, but there was determination in his eyes. "Perhaps it's time to remind you who really makes the rules around here," he added quietly, but so that everyone could hear. And those words were the beginning of the end for Jonathan Miller. The air in the main lobby of the mall was so electrified that it seemed that a little more, and the silence would be broken by thunder. The crowd was thickening, the faces of the visitors expressing a mixture of shock and bewilderment. At the center of the scene was Jonathan Miller, the center's manager, with a face twisted with anger, and a man in a wheelchair, calm but confident, like a rock against a storm. "You're out of line," Jonathan shouted, pointing his finger at the man. His voice, shaking with emotion, echoed through the hall. "You're only here to cause trouble." As if on cue, a voice came from the crowd. "Will you stop it? He's not doing anything wrong." The words came out of the crowd, and Jonathan turned around sharply, trying to find the one who had dared to interrupt him. A middle-aged woman with a bag in her hand stepped out of the crowd. Her face was indignant, but her voice was firm. "You want to kick him out just for his hat? That's absurd." A young guy came forward behind her, holding a cell phone, still recording what was happening. "She's right," he said. "You're violating his rights, and it just looks disgusting, too." The whispers in the crowd turned into a heated discussion. Many people were now openly supporting the man in the wheelchair. Jonathan felt the situation getting completely out of his control. "You all don't understand," he shouted, trying to shout over the crowd. "I'm defending the order of this place." "All right?" One of the employees who was standing outside a nearby store suddenly asked loudly. She stepped forward, looking at Jonathan with a challenge. "You call insults order? We are supposed to protect our customers, not humiliate them." Her words caused a murmur of approval in the crowd. Jonathan shifted his gaze to the female employee, his anger replaced by anxiety. "They're against me? Even my people?" he thought, feeling himself losing ground beneath his feet. "This is none of your business," he shouted, pointing at the female employee. "Go back to work." "No, it's my business," she said, raising her head, "because it's all of our business." Meanwhile, the man in the wheelchair remained calm. His gaze shifted from one person to another, as if he were waiting for something. His silence now seemed even more eloquent than his words. The crowd began to move closer, creating a ring around the stage. Someone from mall security approached Jonathan, trying to restore order. "Minus, Mr. Miller. Maybe we should stop," one of them timidly suggested. "The situation is getting out of control." "Stop?" Jonathan turned to the guard, his eyes burning with anger. "Whose side are you on?" But the guard didn't have time to respond. The man in the wheelchair finally raised his hand, drawing everyone's attention. "I didn't want this to turn into an act," he said loudly but evenly, as if he were directing the action. "But I think this has gotten a little out of hand." "Because you put on this show," Jonathan shouted, unable to hold back. "And now everyone's on your side? It's a farce." But instead of anger, the man smiled slightly. His calmness was icy. "You know, Mr. Miller, sometimes people see the truth in situations like this. Thank you for letting them see it." These words, spoken with cold certainty, turned the atmosphere completely upside down. The crowd murmured in support of the man, and now all eyes were on Jonathan. Someone shouted from the crowd, "Fire him! Let him apologize," added another voice. Jonathan felt trapped. His attempt to assert control had backfired on him. In the eyes of the visitors, he had changed from a strict leader to an oppressor. But, most importantly, he realized for the first time that it might not have been an accident. The man in the wheelchair looked at him as if he already knew how it would end. Amidst the growing noise of the crowd, Jonathan suddenly realized that this conflict was more than just an argument. It was the beginning of something he couldn't understand and couldn't stop. The crowd surrounded the center of the conflict like witnesses in the arena of an ancient theater. People whispered, shouting words of support for the man in the wheelchair and condemnation for Jonathan. The rumble of many voices grew like a rising storm ready to crash ashore. Jonathan Miller stood in the center, as if surrounded by a wall of condemnation and bewilderment. His face flamed with rage, but inside, a cold fear was building. Everything he knew, his confidence, his control over the situation was crumbling right before his eyes. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice barely overpowering the noise of the crowd. "This place is subject to my rules, and I will not tolerate anyone disturbing the order." But his words carried no weight. The crowd had stopped listening to him. Their attention was fixed on the man in the wheelchair, who was still sitting calmly, with a slight smile, as if he were amused by what was happening. Finally, the man raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. The gesture, simple and confident, made everyone freeze in anticipation. "I think it's time to clarify something," he began, his voice steady and clear. In the silence, the words sounded like thunder. "Today, you've seen how one man lets his ego take control of a situation. But you've also seen how people can come together to stand up to injustice." Jonathan snorted, trying to regain some power over the situation. "All you do is talk. Who are you to talk about justice here?" The man looked at him, his gaze cold and penetrating. He paused to let everyone hear his next words. "I am the owner of this mall," he said, crisp and loud, like a shot from a cannon. The crowd gasped. People began to look at each other. Whispers turned into loud discussions. Someone turned off his phone, startled by what he had heard. Jonathan froze like a statue. "What? What did you say?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "You heard right," the man confirmed, his tone icy. "I own this mall, and as its owner, I think we've seen enough today to make some important decisions." Jonathan felt his legs give out. He looked at the crowd, then at his co-workers, then back at the man in the wheelchair. Everyone who had supported him a second ago was now looking at him with judgment or pity. It's some kind of prank," he muttered, trying to regain some control. You can't be the owner. Do you have any doubts?" The man tilted his head, his voice almost friendly but threatening. "You can check the paperwork. My lawyer has them. In the meantime, Mr. Miller, I'd like to hear what you have to say now that you know who I am." Jonathan opened his mouth, but there were no words. His world was crumbling in front of him. What he thought was his territory, his power, was now an illusion. He was standing in front of the man he had just publicly humiliated, and this man was his new employer. The crowd began to applaud. People shouted words of encouragement to the man. Some laughed. Jonathan felt as if he had been thrown into an arena where he was the main object of ridicule and judgment. The man leaned forward. His face was calm, but a cold fire burned in his eyes. "Now you understand, Mr. Miller, that power is more than just the ability to yell at people. Power is responsibility, and it looks like you didn't handle it today." These words sounded like a final verdict. Jonathan couldn't say anything back. He just stood in the center of the hall, surrounded by whispers and judgmental glances, realizing that his career in this mall had just ended. Jonathan stood in his office, looking out the window, but he saw nothing. Everything that was happening outside the crowd, the glowing phone screens, the surprised faces of the employees, was silent. His world had narrowed to a small, suffocating space in his head. He could still feel the cold sweat running down his back. The words of the man in the wheelchair, the new owner of the mall, echoed in his mind. "Power is responsibility. And it looks like you didn't handle it today." Those words cut through his pride like a knife. Jonathan had never thought he could be wrong. His life had been built on rules, on clarity and uncompromisingness. But now he saw a different picture. The crowd condemned him, his co-workers turned their backs on him, and his authority, the one he had prided himself on, crumbled in a matter of minutes. He collapsed into the chair and covered his face with his hands. His breathing was heavy and his thoughts were confused, but one feeling was louder than all the others: fear. "What now?" he thought. "Am I going to be fired? Am I going to be publicly humiliated? What if this man tells all? What if this video gets on the news?" Jonathan glanced at his phone. His notifications were bursting with messages and calls. They were most likely questions from employees, disgruntled tenants, or worse, the corporate office. Each unread message reminded him that this was just the beginning of his downfall. Why did I act like that? Why didn't I stop? It started with a small thing, a cap, a look he found provocative. He saw a threat where none existed and let his ego take over, and now it's cost him everything he's built. Jonathan remembered the man's face, his calmness, his confidence. He knew that this man had been in control of the situation from the beginning. This was not a chance encounter, not impulsive behavior. This was a lesson, hard, painful, and probably the last of his career here. He tried to imagine how he could make things right. Apologize? Go to the man and beg for forgiveness and humiliation? But every time he imagined looking into the eyes of the man he'd insulted in front of dozens of witnesses, his insides clenched. "It's too late. Too late," he thought, shaking his head. A knock on the door pulled him out of his musings. It was Linda, his assistant. Her face was pale, and she was holding a clipboard. "Minus Mr. Miller, the video has already gone viral," she said quietly, looking away. "It's all over social media. People are demanding an apology." Jonathan felt the ground go from under his feet. "And what does corporate say?" His voice shook, almost afraid to hear the answer. Linda paused, then whispered, "They want to talk to you." Now, those words were like a punch to the gut. He stood up slowly. His legs felt like cotton. His whole body was shaking. On the way to the conference room where the call with the top management was to take place, he replayed the day's events over and over in his head. He saw the face of the man in the wheelchair, heard his calm voice, remembered how the crowd had supported him instead of Jonathan. Each step toward the conference room was like a journey toward his own sentence. Something new was brewing inside him. Remorse. But it was not a soft, sincere feeling, but an icy one, filled with fear for his fate. When he opened the door, he was met by the cold stares of the board members. The screen lit up, and the face of the mall owner appeared there, the same man he'd encountered today. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "Or maybe that's not the right term for you." Jonathan swallowed, realizing that this was only the beginning of his reckoning. The silence in the conference room was deafening. Jonathan sat in front of the screen on which the face of the owner of the shopping center appeared. His heart was pounding so loudly that he thought he could be heard even outside the doors. Each second of waiting stretched into an eternity, as the man, who now held Jonathan's fate in his hands, slowly looked around the crowd. "Minus Mr. Miller," he began in a steady but icy voice. "Today you have shown how easily trust and respect can be destroyed, even within the walls of your own workplace." The words stabbed Jonathan like a sharp knife. He swallowed, his hands sweating, but he couldn't say anything. Any attempt to justify himself seemed pointless. Your job as a manager is to create a safe and comfortable space for everyone who comes here. Today, you've done the opposite. The words sounded calm, but there was a power in them that could crush Jonathan's career with the stroke of a pen. He tried to gather his courage. "Sir, he began, but the man raised his hand, stopping him. "I'm not finished," the owner interrupted. His voice dropped like a hammer. And yet, Jonathan held his breath. Everything inside him clenched, waiting for the inevitable. "I believe in the possibility of change," the man continued, softening his tone a little. "Sometimes people need to be shown that they are wrong so that they can admit it and correct it." At that moment, a glimmer of hope flashed across Jonathan's face. His breathing deepened a little, but he was afraid to move. "You made a big mistake," the man continued, his gaze still hard. "But I don't want to be the person who ruins someone else's life over one wrong move, no matter how serious." The crowd outside the hall was still buzzing, discussing what had happened. Jonathan knew that everyone was waiting for a decision. His fate had become a matter of public record. "I'm giving you a chance, Mr. Miller," the owner said abruptly. Those words sounded as if time had stopped for a second. "But chance doesn't mean there won't be consequences. You will be under surveillance. Your actions will be evaluated not only by me, but also by your employees, customers, and every person who enters this shopping center." Jonathan felt the cold sweat running down his back again. He realized that this chance was both an escape and a test. If you can show that you are capable of change, if you prove that you understand the meaning of the word respect, maybe I will see something more in you than what we saw today. The man paused, his gaze softening but not losing its seriousness. "But remember, Mr. Miller, this is your last chance. One more mistake, and we'll never speak again." Jonathan nodded, unable to find the words. His voice trembled when he finally squeezed out, "Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity." The owner looked at him for a long moment, then tilted his head slightly. "Don't thank me, Mr. Miller. Prove you're trustworthy." When the screen went out, the silence in the room came over Jonathan again. He sat still, feeling both relief and fear. He had been given a chance, but he knew that chance was like fragile glass, easily broken. The mall owner, meanwhile, sat in his office and pondered. His decision was not an easy one, but he believed in the power of second chances. Every man can make a mistake, he thought, but justice is not only punishment, it is also an opportunity for redemption. His gaze fell on the picture of his family lying in front of him, where he himself was younger, stronger. He remembered those times when he had been given a chance to change his life. Now he decided to give that chance to someone else. Still, his hands remained on the steering wheel. Control remained with him, and if Jonathan made another wrong move, this chance would quickly become the last of his career. Several weeks had passed since the incident. The mall lived its usual life, the flow of shoppers, the noise of the escalators, the aromas of coffee and pastries from the cafe. But inside, everything had changed. Both visitors and employees felt it. The atmosphere was no longer the same as before. Jonathan Miller was still the manager, but his gait had lost its confidence. He moved leisurely through the corridors, eyes downcast, as if he was afraid he would again be subjected to judgmental stares. And yet he tried. Every action he took, every word he spoke, was aimed at rebuilding what he had destroyed. The first changes were visible almost immediately. Jonathan gathered his team of employees in the conference room where he had previously only given orders. Now he listened. Every employee had the opportunity to express his opinion, and Jonathan wrote down every word. "I realize I've made mistakes," he said during the first meeting. His voice was sincere, but still a little shaky. "I want you to help me correct them. This mall isn't just my place of work, it's home to all of us. And we have to make it better." These words caused first disbelief, then curiosity, then support. People began to notice that Jonathan had changed. He began to approach employees personally, to learn about their problems, to ask questions about what they thought was important. But the main challenge was the attitude towards customers. After an incident with an owner in a wheelchair, Jonathan changed his approach to service. He initiated the Mall for All program aimed at creating an inclusive space. Additional ramps were installed, aisles were widened, and rest areas were created for people with disabilities. The most noticeable change, however, was in his attitude towards people. Jonathan no longer saw clients as objects to be managed. He saw them as people, each of whom came here with their own story. One of the highlights was when an elderly woman who had lost her wallet asked for help. Previously, this would have been left to the security guards, but now Jonathan himself personally helped her find her belongings. The incident went viral on local social media, generating an unexpectedly warm reaction. "Miller has really changed," employees said. "He doesn't look down on us anymore." Meanwhile, the new owner of the mall watched the situation. He rarely appeared in person, but his influence was felt throughout. Every month he sent Jonathan a short letter asking, "What have you done to make this place better?" These questions were a reminder that his chance was still not over. One day, on a quiet weekday afternoon, the owner decided to come to the shopping center unannounced. This time, he was without a cap, but the employees recognized him immediately. They greeted him warmly, and as he walked past the stores and cafes, he noticed small changes that made the space better. When he approached Jonathan, he rose from his seat at once. His gaze was no longer the arrogant confidence it had been before, but now it was determined. "I hope you are pleased, sir," Jonathan said, bowing slightly. The man smiled. "It's not for me, Mr. Miller," he replied. "It's for the people who come here every day. And you know what? I think you're on the right track." These words were not just praise for Jonathan, but a symbol that his labor had not been in vain. Final moral. The story of the shopping center and its manager became known far beyond its borders. It reminded people that power is not a right, but a responsibility. Jonathan learned to see his work not just as control, but as an opportunity to change people's lives for the better. The mall became a symbol of tolerance, change, and second chances, and everyone who entered it knew that not only your money, but also your personality was respected here. Ultimately, this story showed everyone a simple but important truth. Sometimes the biggest changes start with admitting your mistakes and wanting to be better. What do you think about this story? Share your opinion in the comments. We want to know your point of view. Have you ever experienced unfair treatment or discrimination in your life? How did you deal with it? We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful for your support. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories, and give us a like if you liked it. We wish you a good day and remind you that each of us can make the world a better place, starting with ourselves.